Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about the Honors Colloquium course?
Sure. So the Honors Colloquium course is required for all honor students to take as freshmen. We just finished its 7th year, and the topic of the content is immigration and national identity, but it also is a skills-based course trying to prepare students for college, but also to do well all the way through graduate school. So it's got a lot of long-term components as well.
Okay, so why did you choose to center the course around immigration?
I was looking for something that was not exactly controversial, which it is now, but I was looking for something that is a complex problem that has lots of different sides to it, because I was trying to teach critical thinking, and I think you need to have a topic that is not easily answered. I was also looking for something that would work across the curriculum, because part of the point of it was to try to invite faculty from around the campus to be able to participate in it, so that it was something that, you know, whatever major you were in, it still had some connection to it. And immigration worked because it's a big enough topic. It became more and more controversial, and also because we're all going to have to work with people who are different, so it seemed like it applied to everything.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on the current situation that's going on with refugees, and how is that going to affect the course in the future?
So I am going to be very careful and measured about my thoughts. But it's ridiculous, and it's just such a shame that it got politicized, and it got politicized for all the wrong reasons, because people don't seem to understand. They were seeing these images of refugees, migrants really. Refugees is a very particular term that means somebody who has achieved a certain status through registration and background checks, and is somebody who is fleeing from well-founded fear of persecution. Many of the people who were streaming over into Europe were refugees, but not officially. They were fleeing persecution, but they weren't registered in any way. And so people are confusing the very narrow specific term that we use in the United States with our refugee resettlement program, and the very broad term that they were using in the news. And so the fact, I think, that it was on TV made it feel like it was coming into our living rooms, and people forgot that there's this giant ocean, and that there's no way that could ever happen in this country, because physically it doesn't work. You have to buy a plane ticket, and nobody can afford the plane ticket for 8 people. And so it got politicized for ridiculous, terrible reasons, and then we are now doing way less than our fair share in trying to help people. And you know, that's, our country was founded on that, so it couldn't be more horrible.
Right. So are you saying that the media is at fault for the reason people are afraid of refugees?
I don't think I think the media probably could have done a better job at the beginning articulating the difference between refugees and migrants, but I really think the problem is the medium itself. I think, you know, everybody in our country was capable of getting PTSD watching the buildings fall on September 11th, when nobody was in any actual danger, right? So I think it's the medium is so powerful on us. I don't think it's a fault thing, but I think it means that fears get exaggerated. I think the media, not the media, I think television is very good at exaggerating our fears, because it makes it feel like things far away are much closer than they are.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think are some of the most important things that people should know about refugees?
That less than 1% of all people who flee their country are ever resettled. They have no choice about what country they're resettled in, and they go through 18 months to 2 years of background checking, and I can't imagine what would be more extreme than what's already happening. I was reading an article from somebody who was one of the people who do the vetting, and the interviews, they do multiple in-person interviews, which can run 5 or 6 hours long. And if you make a single mistake and say something differently than you said the last time, they can dismiss you for no reason at all. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that that would be a way for terrorists to come into our country is ridiculous. It, you know, much larger chance of getting struck by lightning than getting into the country that way. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would want people to know, is that you know, there's no way 100% to prevent somebody from becoming radicalized at some point in their life, but that program's already pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. So going back to more like colloquium focused, How do you think the current situation is going to affect the course in the future? Are you having more ideas about different curriculums you want to implant in there or anything?
So are you asking me whether I'm going to ditch the refugees?
No, I'm thinking, are you going to change the course in terms of more empathy building and less professionalism, or maybe some different exercises that are a little more intense?
Mm-hmm. So it's a great question. So we had our first colloquium revision meeting, and the first question that I asked the group was, given how politicized this has become, because what had been going on before for the last 7 years, the question was, we have this refugee resettlement program and we have this immigration program. What is it, and what do we, and how do we make it work, and how does it work? Now it's not a fact, it's a question.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I wonder whether the course isn't going to be seen as taking a side, when even more than it already has been. You know, some people saw it as taking a side, although I tried really hard to make it even-handed.
Mm-hmm.
But now that the whole question of refugees and the whole question of immigration is a question, anything that is, you know, giving you more information about it is going to look like an argument.
Right.
So, so I have to work much harder at trying to balance providing people with actual facts with giving opportunities for questions without giving space for false information. And that's going to be a really tricky balance.
So do you think that you will mention this situation right now in the course next year? Like perhaps as an example?
The travel ban?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure it will come up.
Okay.
Especially because even when the travel ban is lifted, it's going to have huge implications for things. So for instance, in addition to the travel ban, he lowered the number of refugees coming into the country from 110 to 50.
Mm-hmm.
So he dropped it by more than half. Refugees get resettled in fits and starts, and so more people were resettled in December and January. So there have only been 35,000 of the 50. We were expecting 110, which means that there may be hardly any new families coming to Jacksonville,
Mm-hmm.
which means that you know, who we mentor is going to be a completely different group of people if we're able to manage it. Also, that just changes the whole scope of things. So yeah, I think it's going to come up.
So do you think that the program's at risk if the ban stays?
The colloquium part of it?
The service project of the refugees.
So, yes and no. It's
Mm-hmm.
certainly not necessarily going to look like it has been looking,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm pretty good at figuring out how to make things work anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm doing now is trying to help the agencies come up with their long-term plans, and one of them is to shift from newly arrived refugees, since there'll be fewer of them, to working with people who've already been here 90 days, who, you know, because the services only last 90 days to start with.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been not all that, most of the focus has been on that first 90 days,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where the federal funding is,
Mhm.
and that was the easiest funding to get. But if these agencies want to stay in business and want to stay in Jacksonville, they're going to need to find other sources of funding, which is going to be a real trick,
Mm-hmm.
to help those families from the 90 days and beyond. But what that means is that the people who are here could get extended and more intensive help, and we can be a part of that.
Okay.
So, but it means if the agency, so I'm trying to help make sure the agencies are able to do that.
Okay.
And then the second thing I'm doing is, in case they can't, because World Relief in particular could close because all they do is refugee resettlement.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may not, the economics may not work with the fewer number, even if they get through the travel ban. And so I'm preparing for the idea that maybe we will have 1 or 2 resettlement agencies instead of 3,
Mm-hmm.
in which case I want to try to identify who are the influencers in the refugee communities. Like, can I find an Iraqi and a Burmese Chin and a Burmese Karen and a Burmese and who know people? Can I identify where the churches are so that I can still connect with those communities? And even if we can't do them through the agencies, is there a way that maybe we could do through those churches
Mhm.
or some other kind of organization?
Okay. So that being said, do you expect the service project to be more or less involved in the coming years?
I think more involved, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be complicated, so I don't know for sure, because the liability issues are going to get a lot more complicated because we've been able to, the children are all covered under World Relief or Catholic Charities liability, but if we're working through churches, I don't know how that'll work. So it's possible that things won't work, but I think after 7 years, I feel pretty confident that I can find the families. Whether I can find the bureaucratic infrastructure is the other question.
Okay. So what are your techniques on making a controversial class seem a little more neutral?
So one of them is, as you suggested at the beginning, trying to focus more on empathy. So we came up with a series of ideas starting in retreat to help break down some of the things that divide us, and I think that's really important anyway, not even for the class, but for the country. So for instance, when we were doing things about political parties, we were asking people to try to figure out which party and which candidate they identified with, but that made people sort of tribal, right? So I'm discovering that I'm a Democrat, or I'm discovering that I'm a Republican, or I'm discovering that I'm a Libertarian or a Green, or whatever it is. But instead of trying to narrow people to that, what I'm thinking about doing is some exercises that ask people to break down stereotypes and recognize what they have in common. So for instance, the deliberative democracy activity that we did is designed, I don't think it works as well as it could have, but I think there's a way to emphasize what you're supposed to get out of that. In part is that we share values. We're supposed to get, I'm interested in these things because I care about these values. So for instance, one value in immigration is safety and security, and that's what President Trump is focused on. But the other value that's in conflict is inclusiveness. But the thing is, probably all of us would agree that both safety and inclusiveness are important, but we're valuing them differently. But if we can recognize that, like, yeah, okay, it's not that I'm against safety,
Right.
but that I feel like the way to safety is this long-term way of including people, and you think the way to safety is to wall things off. But we both agree that safety is important. So like there's some common ground there so that we don't feel so much like, you know, who are these alien beings who think so differently than I?
Right.
And so if I can shift some of the things like the political stuff that way so that instead of creating identities, we're breaking down those identities, I think that will make it feel less controversial and also introduce more critical thinking, which I think is important.
Yeah, I know you tried to focus on that anyway, but
Even more so.
yeah. And do you ever face complaints from students or parents that disagree with the course's subject matter? How do you handle them?
We have once had a parent at an info session, like before anybody had applied, stomp around upset about the topic. Wasn't for them. And, you know, luckily they weren't. I think anybody who joins, because we make a big deal about colloquium in our information sessions, is willing to deal. We probably don't hear from people who really disagree with it. Once students are in it, I certainly have students who do complain that the class is one-sided or biased or whatever, and I try to really pay attention to those complaints, and I try to figure out where I could change things. So for instance, I'm worried that some of the lectures that we have, which are, to my mind, very fact-based, but if you, in this age of contested facts, I wonder whether talking about economics or criminal justice, we aren't going to get even more pushback than we normally do. So one thing I was wondering was I might cut one of those too. So I might cut down on the number of opportunities when the information, there's so much facts that because the professors are pretty sure that this just is true, that this isn't an interpretation, but to people who are living in a different world of alternative facts, that's going to seem like bias, right? So I can't, in a big class, I can't really attack that. So I might reduce the number of opportunities where that happens. And then the other thing I was thinking about was, I don't know if this will work, but it's an idea. If we, the week before, we talk about, next week we're going to be talking about economics. What questions do we have about economics that we would like the professor to address? And then have people submit them, and even anonymously. And then take that list of questions and give it to the professor before they speak, a couple of days before they speak, so that it can be more of a dialogue, and that might help it feel less like I'm lecturing at you and more like I'm giving you facts as answers to your questions, and that might help some.
Okay. And the last question is, what is the most important thing you think that students should know about refugees? Big picture. If you already said it, it's okay.
I probably did already say it.
Mhm.
I think the fact that it's such a tiny number.
Mhm.
The other thing is that, they're ordinary people. They're
Mhm.
ordinary, often, working class, middle class. These are not people. To be a refugee, you have to have had the persistence to continue to go back for meetings and provide more information for a couple of years.
Mhm.
You have to have had the strong desire to get your family out of there, to have left in the first place. You have to have, you have to be somebody who takes initiative. I feel like to have, and then to have been successful at that, you had to have been able to be very honest, keep your story straight, make no mistakes, be convincing, communicate clearly. Like, there's this whole set of skills that it takes to have gotten through that process, and you have to want this so badly that you're willing to do all that. So I feel like anybody who becomes a refugee and gets resettled is somebody who is capable of making an enormous contribution, because they already proved perseverance, persistence, determination, love of family, desire for something better, the vision to recognize what was happening and when it was time to get out, ability to follow rules, like all of these good qualities that I think will make them very successful in our country.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah,
Kaplan.
no problem.
All right. Oh, wow. I made you talk for quite some time.
It's all good. So the one good thing I can tell you that I think is coming out of all this